The crystal chandelier in the grand dining room of the Sterling estate shattered the silence long before Julian Sterling could even process the words. Victoria Vance stood at the head of the mahogany table, her designer silk dress pristine, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. She held a medical document in her trembling hands, her eyes welled with perfectly orchestrated tears. Julian, the enigmatic 32-year-old CEO of Sterling Global, stared at her, his face a mask of stone, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "I'm pregnant with your baby, Julian," Victoria announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We don't need to wait for the spring wedding. We need to marry now. For our family." Julian's mother, Eleanor Sterling, gasped from her seat, her hand flying to her pearls, a triumphant smile already forming on her lips. For months, Eleanor had pushed for this union, viewing Victoria as the ultimate asset to the Sterling legacy. But Julian felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He looked at Victoria, the woman he had agreed to marry out of corporate duty and family expectation, but a profound sense of wrongness gripped him. Before Julian could find his voice, a small, sudden clatter broke the heavy tension. From the shadow of the doorway that led to the industrial kitchen, a silver spoon bounced across the polished hardwood floor. A toddler, no older than 2, toddled into the dining room. He had unruly dark curls and striking, piercing blue eyes, eyes that were a mirror image of Julian's own. Following closely behind him was Clara Evans, the 24-year-old live-in maid who had been hired just 6 months ago. Clara's face drained of color as she realized where her son had run. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to scoop the boy into her arms. "Leo, no, come here," Clara whispered, her voice tight with panic. But Leo didn't move toward his mother. Instead, he pointed his chubby little finger directly at Victoria, his big blue eyes wide with innocent recognition. In a loud, clear toddler voice, he chirped, "Dada's pretty doctor." The room froze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Julian's gaze snapped from the toddler to Victoria, whose face had gone from tearfully radiant to completely ash-white in a fraction of a second. Clara gasped, quickly covering her son's mouth, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Clara, take your child out of here immediately," Eleanor snapped, her aristocratic voice cutting through the air like a knife. "He is disrupting a private family moment." But Julian didn't move. His sharp mind, the same intellect that had built an empire, was rewinding through the last few months, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. He looked at Clara, a woman who always kept her head down, who worked tirelessly, and who possessed a quiet, independent strength that Julian had secretly admired from afar. Then he looked at Leo. The resemblance between himself and the boy was something he had dismissed as a mere coincidence before. But Dada's pretty doctor changed everything. "Wait," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the immense authority that commanded boardrooms across the country. He stood up, walking slowly toward the maid and her child. "Leo, what did you just say?" Victoria lunged forward, grabbing Julian's arm, her grip desperate. "Julian, darling, don't listen to a toddler. He's confused. He probably saw me at a charity event or something. We need to focus on our baby, our future." Julian gently but firmly removed Victoria's hand from his sleeve. He kept his eyes locked on Clara, who was now trembling, holding Leo tightly against her chest. "Clara," Julian said softly, yet the undercurrent of tension was palpable. "Why would your son associate Victoria with his father?" Clara swallowed hard, her eyes pooling with tears. She looked at Victoria, and for a brief moment, a flash of pure, unadulterated fear passed between the two women. He doesn't know what he's saying, Mr. Sterling. He's just a baby. Please excuse us." Clara stood up to leave, but Julian stepped into her path. The cinematic illusion of his perfect life was cracking, revealing a web of deceit that he was determined to unravel. "My fiancée just announced she is pregnant. Your son just called her his father's doctor. Victoria is a corporate marketing executive, Clara. She has never stepped foot inside a medical school. So, I will ask you one more time. How does Leo know her?" Victoria stepped back, her breath hitching. "Julian, this is absurd. You are insulting me and our unborn child by entertaining the ramblings of the hired help's bastard son." "That's enough, Victoria," Julian said, his tone icy. He turned to his head of security, Marcus, who was always stationed near the entrance. "Marcus, lock the doors. No one leaves this house until I get some answers." The heavy oak doors of the Sterling mansion clicked shut, signaling the beginning of a confrontation that would dismantle everything Julian thought he knew about his family, his wealth, and the woman he was about to marry. Julian led Clara and a crying Leo into his private study, away from his mother's frantic protests and Victoria's shrill, indignant cries. He closed the soundproof door and pointed to the leather sofa. Clara sat down on the edge of the cushion, rock solid in her attempt to protect her child. Julian poured a glass of water and handed it to her, watching how her hands shook. "Clara, I am not a patient man," Julian began, pacing the length of the room, "but I am a fair one. I know when someone is lying to me, and right now, everyone in that dining room is lying except for that little boy. Tell me the truth. Who is Leo's father?" Clara looked down at her son, who was now distracted by a shiny brass paperweight on the coffee table. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. "If I tell you, she will ruin me, Julian. She promised she would take Leo away from me, and she has the money and the power to do it." Julian paused, his chest tightening. "Victoria threatened you 3 years ago," Clara began, her voice a fragile whisper. "Before I worked here, before I knew who you were. I was working 2 jobs, trying to pay off my father's medical bills. I met a man at a charity gala I was waitressing. He was kind, brilliant, and we spent a beautiful, intense month together. He told me his name was Luke. He didn't want the cameras, he didn't want the press, he just wanted me. But then he disappeared. No phone calls, no notes. Nothing." Julian froze. 3 years ago, he had suffered a severe bout of amnesia following a high-speed car accident that nearly took his life. He had lost a chunk of his memory, specifically the 4 weeks leading up to the crash. His mother and Victoria, who was his girlfriend at the time, had told him he had been away on a solo reclusive retreat in upstate New York to clear his head from corporate burnout. "Go on," Julian managed to say, his throat dry. "A few weeks later, I found out I was pregnant," Clara continued, clutching the water glass. "I tried to find him, but Luke didn't exist. It wasn't until I saw a business magazine a year later that I saw your face. Julian Sterling. I realized the man I loved was a billionaire. I tried to contact your office, but your security blocked me. Then Victoria found out. She cornered me at my apartment. She told me that if I ever came near you, she would use the Vance family lawyers to brand me an extortionist, a stalker, and have Leo taken by child services. She said you hated me, that I was just a mistake." Julian felt the room spin. The pieces of his fractured memory were slamming into place with terrifying force. He remembered a small cabin. He remembered the smell of rain. He remembered a laugh that haunted his dreams, a laugh that belonged to Clara, not Victoria. "Why did you come to work here then?" Julian asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow. "Because my apartment burned down 6 months ago," Clara sobbed. "I lost everything. An agency offered me this live-in position. I didn't know it was your house until I arrived. Victoria found out and she made a deal with me. She said if I stayed here, kept my mouth shut, and acted as a maid, she would let me keep Leo. She said she was keeping an eye on me. She brought a doctor to see Leo when he was sick a month ago. A private doctor to make sure I wasn't using your family name at a public hospital. Leo saw her talking to the doctor, commanding him. He thought she owned the doctor. He thought she was the doctor." Julian walked over to the desk, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. The betrayal was staggering. The woman he was supposed to marry had not only hidden his own son from him, but she had also manipulated his life, exploited a woman in desperate need, and used his amnesia as a weapon to secure her place by his side. Suddenly, the study door burst open. Victoria stood there, her composure completely shattered, her eyes wild. "Julian, you cannot believe a word this opportunistic peasant is saying. She's trying to grift you. She wants your money." Julian turned around slowly. The anger radiating from him was a physical force. "The only person who wanted my money, Victoria, was you. And your time is officially up." Victoria scoffed, trying to regain her upper-class bravado. "You think you can just throw me out? I am carrying the Sterling heir, Julian. Your mother will never allow you to discard me for a common maid." "We'll see about that," Julian whispered, a dangerous calm settling over him. "Because we are going to the hospital right now. For a DNA test. For both babies." The drive to the elite private medical facility owned by the Sterling Foundation was conducted in a silence so thick it was suffocating. Julian sat in the front of the luxury SUV, his eyes fixed on the road, while Victoria sat in the back, staring out the window, furiously typing on her phone. Clara sat next to her, holding Leo tightly, refusing to look at the woman who had terrorized her for years. Upon arrival, Julian's status ensured they were bypassed directly into a private VIP wing. Dr. Harrison, a longtime family physician who owed his career to the Sterling family's philanthropy, greeted them with a strained smile, sensing the nuclear tension in the air. "Julian, what is the meaning of this late-night emergency?" Dr. Harrison asked, leading them into a secure consultation room. "I need 2 DNA tests administered immediately, Tom," Julian said, his voice flat and uncompromising. "One for this child, Leo, and a non-invasive prenatal paternity test for Victoria." Victoria slammed her designer handbag onto the examination table. "This is an outrage. Julian, I am your fiancé. I will not be subjected to this humiliation just because you're having a psychological break over a maid's lies. If you have nothing to hide, Victoria, then the test will prove your innocence," Julian replied, crossing his arms, "and it will secure your place as the future Mrs. Sterling. Isn't that what you want?" Victoria's jaw tightened. She looked at Dr. Harrison, then at Julian, her eyes darting toward the exit. "Fine. But I want it noted that this is under duress, and when the results come back, I expect a public apology and an immediate wedding. Administer the tests, Tom. Rush the results." "I want them on my desk by morning," Julian ordered, as Dr. Harrison's team moved in to take the cheek swabs from Leo and a blood draw from Victoria. Julian stepped out into the hallway to catch his breath. His mind was a chaotic storm. If Clara was telling the truth, his entire life for the past 3 years had been a carefully constructed lie orchestrated by his own fiancée, and potentially his own mother. Clara stepped out into the hallway a moment later, leaving Leo with a nurse who was entertaining him with a coloring book. She stood a few feet away from Julian, looking fragile but fiercely dignified in her simple maid's uniform. "You don't have to do this, Julian," Clara said softly. "I never wanted to cause a war in your family. I just wanted to raise my son in peace." Julian turned to look at her, really look at her, stripped of the corporate blinders he had been wearing. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, but he also saw the warmth that had been missing from his life for as long as he could remember. "If he is my son, Clara, it's not just your war, it's mine. And if Victoria lied to me about you, about my amnesia, about everything, she has been fighting a war against me for 3 years. I'm just finally waking up to fight back." Before Clara could respond, Julian's phone buzzed. It was a text from his head of security, Marcus, who had been tasked with auditing Victoria's personal financial accounts and communication logs linked to the Sterling global server. The text read, "Sir, we found something. You need to see this immediately. I'm uploading the files to your secure drive." Julian opened the encrypted files on his tablet. His blood turned to ice as he scrolled through the data. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was a corporate coup. Victoria's family company, Vance Enterprises, was on the brink of bankruptcy, and she had been funneling millions from Sterling Global's offshore accounts into her family's coffers, using Julian's forged digital signatures she had obtained while he was recovering in the hospital from his amnesia 3 years ago. But the final document was the ultimate betrayal. It was a medical record from a private clinic in Europe dated just 2 weeks ago. Victoria had undergone a procedure that made it biologically impossible for her to be pregnant. Her announcement tonight was a desperate fabricated lie to force a marriage before Julian's financial auditors discovered the missing millions. Julian closed the tablet, his face pale, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He looked up at Clara, his voice cracking with a mix of horror and sudden, absolute clarity. "She isn't pregnant, Clara. She never was." The morning sun had barely begun to cast its golden glow over the sprawling Sterling estate when Julian returned, flanked by Marcus and a team of forensic accountants. The grand mansion, usually a symbol of quiet luxury and unshakable power, felt like a stage set about to collapse. Eleanor Sterling was waiting in the main drawing room, sipping Earl Grey tea from a porcelain cup, looking entirely unbothered. Victoria sat opposite her, having returned from the hospital hours earlier, looking smug and victorious. She believed her family's influence and Eleanor's backing would shield her from any real fallout. "Julian, thank goodness you're back," Eleanor said, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "I hope you've put an end to this ridiculous circus. We have a wedding to plan, and I will not have the family name dragged through the mud by a disgruntled employee." Julian walked into the center of the room, his presence dark and imposing. He didn't sit down. Clara entered behind him, holding Leo, who was fast asleep, against her shoulder. "The circus is over, Mother," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud, But the criminal prosecution is just beginning. Victoria's smile faltered. She looked at the folder, then at Julian. What is that? That is the comprehensive audit of Sterling Global's offshore accounts, combined with the medical records, Doctor. Harrison just verified from your trip to Switzerland 2 weeks ago, Julian said, his eyes drilling into her. You aren't pregnant, Victoria. You had a total hysterectomy last year due to a medical complication. You forged my signature, embezzled $42 million to bail out Vance Enterprises, and tonight, you tried to trap me into a marriage to cover up your grand larceny. Victoria's face drained of all color. She stood up, her voice rising in a shrill panic. That's a lie. Those records are fabricated. Julian, you love me. We've been together for years. We were together because you took advantage of my amnesia. Julian roared, his control finally snapping. The sheer force of his voice made Eleanor flinch. You and my mother lied to me. You told me I was in upstate New York 3 years ago, when in reality I was living in a small coastal town, hiding from the pressure of this family, and I was with Clara. I loved her. And you used my accident to wipe her from my life and steal my son. Julian turned his furious gaze to his mother. Eleanor looked away, her aristocratic mask cracking for the first time in her life. Mother, you knew Leo was my son. You knew Clara was working here. You helped Victoria hide it. Julian, I did it for the family, Eleanor defended herself, her voice trembling but defiant. A maid? A girl from nothing? What would the board say? What would society say? Victoria was the appropriate choice for the Sterling legacy. The Sterling legacy is built on honor, not theft and psychological abuse, Julian shouted. He turned to Marcus, who was standing at the door. Marcus, the police are waiting outside. Escort Miss Vance to them. She is being charged with embezzlement, fraud, and corporate espionage. And as for you, Mother, you will be stepping down from the Sterling Foundation Board effective immediately. You will retire to the estate in Palm Beach, and if you ever step foot near my son or Clara again, I will cut your allowance to 0 and strip you of the Sterling name. Victoria began to scream, cursing Julian and Clara as Marcus and 2 uniformed officers entered the room, cuffing her wrists and leading her away. The grand illusion of her life was shattered, dragged out of the mansion in plastics and shame. Eleanor, broken and defeated, silently stood up and walked out of the room, unable to face the son she had betrayed. The drawing room fell completely silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage of a lie that had lasted 3 years. Julian stood in the center of the room, his shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth crushing him. Clara walked forward slowly, Leo still asleep in her arms. She looked at Julian not as the powerful billionaire CEO, but as the man named Luke she had fallen in love with in a small cabin by the sea 3 years ago. Julian, she whispered softly. Julian turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked at Clara, then down at the sleeping boy who carried his eyes, his blood, and his future. I remember, Clara, he said, his voice breaking. When I looked at those financial files, when I saw the dates, the fog in my mind cleared. I remember the cabin. I remember the way you look when you laugh. I remember telling you that I wanted to leave the corporate world behind, just to be with you. I am so sorry. I am so sorry I let them take me away from you. Clara smiled through her tears, stepping closer until she was standing right in front of him. You didn't let them, Julian. They stole you. But you found your way back to us. Julian reached out, his hand trembling as he gently stroked his son's dark curls, then placed his palm against Clara's cheek. For the first time in 3 years, the emptiness in his chest vanished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming warmth. 6 months later, the Sterling estate was no longer a cold, sterile fortress of corporate power. The high ceilings echoed not with the sharp heels of high society functions, but with the bright, infectious laughter of a toddler chasing a golden retriever across the expansive lawns. Julian stood on the grand terrace, a cup of coffee in hand, watching Leo play. The corporate empire of Sterling Global was stronger than ever, but Julian's priorities had completely shifted. He no longer lived for the boardroom. He lived for the family he had almost lost. Victoria Vance had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, and Eleanor remained in self-imposed exile in Palm Beach, completely forgotten by the society she had sacrificed her soul to please. A pair of soft hands wrapped around Julian's waist from behind, and he felt a warm cheek press against his back. He turned around, smiling down at Clara, who looked radiant in a simple white sundress, her hair flowing in the gentle morning breeze. There were no maid uniforms, no hidden identities, and no secrets between them. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, looking up at him with eyes full of love and absolute trust. Julian pulled her into his arms, kissing the top of her head. I was just thinking about how lucky I am. I spent years thinking my wealth was my greatest achievement. But the best thing that ever happened to me was a silver spoon bouncing across a dining room floor and a little boy pointing his finger at a lie." Clara laughed, leaning her head against his chest. "He certainly has a way of making an entrance." Julian looked out over his estate, his heart full, knowing that the empire he built would one day belong to the son who had saved him. The hidden billionaire had finally found the one thing money could never buy, his true home.